Well, good evening, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the fourth and final session of the Isle of Wight Natural History and Archaeological Society's Centenary webinars, Environmental Change, Past, Present and Future. We've had some excellent speakers so far, and there are 3 more this evening. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has been at the forefront of our minds this year, and it's caused us to move our conference to these online sessions. Looking back briefly, the Society was formed in 1919, just after Spanish flu swept the world. So the concept of pandemic would have been familiar to them, even if their experience was rather different. And I wonder what our founding members would have made of our use of technology to promote the objects of the Society. Although our focus is the Isle of Wight, the principles under discussion are applicable to living systems worldwide. And we wonder what our reach has been. Feel free to let us know in the chat box if you're off island. We'd like to know where everyone is. There's been considerable mention in previous sessions of the importance of observing and recording of the Society's activities. Equally important is the communication of these findings in order that we can benefit from them. The Society has produced a variety of publications in its history, both occasional and regular. Occasional publications include, for example, 2 floras in 1978 and 2003, which document the occurrence of vascular plants and the changes in the populations. And in 1969, the Society's Golden Jubilee publication, Botany, Birds, Bugs and Barrows, gave an overview of our activities and interests. The regular publications are part of the membership benefits of the Society. Initially, a yearly journal called the Proceedings of the Isle of Wight Natural History and Archaeological Society was produced, and it included reports of meetings, lists of new members, excursions, short reports of members' observations, as well as longer articles. Over the years, these publications have expanded. Members now receive 2 bulletins per year containing reports of meetings and short accounts by a wide range of contributors. There's also an annual bird report containing detailed analysis of submitted record, which is produced jointly with the Isle of Wight Ornithological Group. And also yearly, we have Wight Studies, as the Proceedings is now known, which contains longer articles and research papers about the island. And our communications continue to develop, and they're now digital newsletters for those having email. So that's a little bit more about us. And our speakers for this evening are among those who've contributed to Wight Studies over the years, including one of the former editors. Our first speaker is Clive Chatters. And Clive joined the Society when he was living on the island in the early 1980s. This time, in fact, he was working with both Richard and John, our other speakers, in a variety of roles, both paid and voluntary. When he moved off the island, he went back to Hampshire, and he's worked with Nature Conservancy Council, or Natural England as it now is, and then the Wildlife Trust. So he's not really been out of our sight for very long. He did say he had some time off for good behaviour when he's done national work. And the thing that perhaps you may have heard of in connection with is his helping to establish a New Forest National Park. So Clive, over to you now then to give us our first talk on heathlands, please.
Thank you, Anne. I'm here tonight as Citizen Clive, rather than speaking on behalf of the Wildlife Trust, so I can have a little bit more fun. Firstly, happy anniversary, 100 years old, the Society. You know, that is a real achievement, 100 years of making real progress in natural history. Now, my presentation over the next 20-25 minutes is based on work that I started in the early 1980s when I was living on the island. And I've got very fond memories of the Society at that time, and seeing some of the people joining us this evening. There's some very old friends there. Not only the generosity in sharing knowledge of archaeology, natural history, but also during my more impecunious times, there were kind offers of hot meals, hot baths, maybe the odd glass of wine. And as a good greenie, I've taken that work from 40 years ago. It's been updated and recycled, and that's what you're going to get. So the arc of my talk, a very simple narrative arc, is we'll start by celebrating what we got, we'll mourn what we've lost, and then I'll be optimistic looking to the future. And at this point, I'm going to try to share my screen. Let's see if it works. Heaton Hill, one of the most celebrated of the island's heaths. There we are, sitting over sands and clays, little bits of interspersed calcareous elements overlain with gravel, a classic lowland heath of one of the smaller English counties, fragmented from its historic landscape and having lost many of its finer grained habitats. But you're looking there across to the New Forest over the old Colwell Common, Colwell Heath. The second largest heath on the island is probably that sitting on the chalk at Ventnor Downs, where those deep beds of angular flint provide the heathland soils. It's an interesting place when you travel around the country. Whilst it has altitude and, my word, it has a lot of sunshine, it is also very humid. So we have big stands of things like bilberry and some quite magnificent stands of bracken. Bracken habitats are heathland too. They are some of the best and richest heathland habitats, and they're rather demonized, but we'll touch on that later. In fact, it was the first piece of natural history I ever did on the Isle of Wight when I arrived on my motorbike, and I climbed on over the chalk pit of Brook Down. In amongst these stands of gorse, there are some magnificent areas of chalk heath, where, unlike the Ventnor Downs, the heathers and the other heathy elements in the vegetation are rooted into the chalk soil, and due to the extraordinarily stressed environment here, we end up with this mixture of calcicole and calcifuge. And just before I leave those three pictures, I salute the role of the National Trust here in caring for these wonderful places. All three of those are National Trust estate. And last but not least of this little bit of celebration is the island does very well for places where heathland species can be found, but they're not really heathland habitats, and they're certainly not heathland landscapes. We'll all recognise the slips at Black Gang, where if you're brave enough to get onto the terraces, you can find all sorts of classic heathland species. Right, there's this celebration. Now let's get depressing. That's the trouble with us conservationists. Here is a conjectural map. I emphasise conjectural. It is what it says: heathlands on the Isle of Wight circa 1600. Now, this is a broad definition of heath because I've included the wood pasture matrices in here, which we know were at Parkhurst and Borthwood and maybe elsewhere. And it's a map that I derived from eclectic sources: field names, field patterns, historic cartography, various deeds, relic vegetation. It is a reasonably good impression of where our heathlands were. They're the orangey brown bits, and as you can see, they cover the geological diversity of the island. That counts for about 10% of the island, about 4,120 hectares. Conjectural is fun, but we can populate it with wildlife. So what I'm going to do, I'm sure that most people know the island far better than me now. I've been away for too long, but I'm mostly going to be concentrating on that Parkhurst to Hampstead in the top right hand in the Hampshire Basin, and then the Borthwood Apse area in the Green Sand Vale to the south of the chalk. We are blessed with Murray's Natural History of the Isle of Wight, 1908, superb collection of records, as well as other sources of data. And I'm blessed by the help of Paul Brock, who has lent me these magnificent photographs of invertebrates. The northern heaths of the island had a superb butterfly fauna. It was described by Maury. The butterflies of that Hampstead, Parkhurst area, he describes as things like the pearl-bordered fritillary being common throughout that. There's pearl-bordered frit, I think that's a female, small pearl-bordered frit. sitting there in its bracken habitat. These are violet feeding butterflies that are very much associated with species-rich bracken, where you get grassy, herbaceous ground under the bracken. And you can still see them doing their heathland thing if you go to the southern heaths of Dartmoor, just on the outskirts of Plymouth. We've lost them. More limited in their distribution were two more of the fritillary butterflies, dark green and the hide brown. Is dark green. Of course, this is still a heathland butterfly in the New Forest. In the southern heaths of the forest, it's really quite widespread. The hide brown is still a bracken heath species, a place like Crapston, Yelveston, on the southern edges of Dartmoor, in the suburbs of Plymouth. But none of these violet feeding fritillaries need trouble us with their transient beauty. The pearl-bordered small pearls have gone locally extirpated in my lifetime, the others somewhat longer. But it didn't stop at that. The non-violet feeding butterflies, silver-studded blues, were known to Moray from Parkhurst through to Hampstead. This is a butterfly of vigorous young heathers, grazed burnt, and they form this symbiotic relationship with Lasius ants. And their distribution was shared also by marsh fritillaries, which Moray referred to as a greasy fritillary. And again, it was that Parkhurst, Hampstead area. Dark green fritillary survives on the island as a chalk grassland species. The rest have gone as those northern heaths are being fragmented, forested. Tree planting has been devastating for them. They're being built on, they've been overgrown. Now, all of these butterflies are associated with their food plants, and we'll start off with the marsh frit, since that was our last picture, and devil's bit scabious. Plants are more fortunate than butterflies. They don't have to breed and set up a new population every year. Their herbaceous plants are very good at hanging on in there, very good relics of the landscape. Devil's bit scabious abundance in heathland habitats with marsh frits. Go down to Devon, the Colne grasslands, Devon, Cornwall, and then work up the west coast of Britain, and it's still reasonably widespread where found. Helen gave us a lovely talk last week looking at mentioning the reddish buff in passing. Of course, Solwort, another one of these rather splendid herbaceous plants of clayey heathland. And narrow-leaved lungwort, actually saw some today in flower, wild stuff. Not really a heathland plant, it's a very Catholic plant. It's in the bracken heaths, it's in marl heaths, it's in heathland scrubs, as well as in various woodlands and even species-rich grasslands. Yet it's highly localised to the Pleistocene Solent River. All of those heathland herbaceous plants are doing pretty well. Some losses, but doing pretty well. Not everything is. One of my favourites, the pilwort fern, that has been playing peekaboo with naturalists for the last century and a half. There in the 19th century, lost in the 1920s, reappeared 2002 at Boldner, appears to have gone away again, but it'll be persisting as spores. This is actually quite a globally rare species, and we do have a particular responsibility. But if you don't have large grazing animals trampling around your clay pits, you won't have pilwort. Carex montana, the soft-leaved sedge, I'm sure it's going to be rediscovered. I put that challenge out to society members. It was known in Parkhurst up until the 1920s. It's very persistent sedge, very, very faithful to these species-rich clay heaths across southern England. Highly unlikely to be rediscovered is the field gentian. There are very good records for it at Colwell Common, Colwell Heath. And if you just cross the Solent, it's in huge abundance in one or two sites in the New Forest. In fact, you can measure it by the square kilometre on its best New Forest site. slightly enriched soils in these species-rich grassy heaths, still got quite a lot of cluna and others, sub-shrubs in them, but associated with gross disturbance, in this case, arable cultivation for the best part of a decade before being thrown back to the heath. A general observation on many of these heathland species: they need high degrees of stress. They thrive following periods of gross disturbance. And my favourite of those species of gross disturbance is this scruffy little oik of a plant, the small Fleabane, Pilocare vulgaris. Once was common throughout the lowlands of the Welsh borders in southern England, now confined to the New Forest and the associated Avon Valley heathlands. This was the classic plant of where large grazing animals would trample around the edge of the pond or the edge of the farm gate or the village green at the edge of a series of commons. It was known from St Helens Green, it was known from near Chale, Hardingshoot, the Wilderness, Apps Manor. You know, it had a very wide distribution on the island, not associated with geology, associated with high pressure grazing. And just because I can, Bob Gibbons gave me this fantastic picture that looks like Van Gogh should take an interest in small Fleabane. It stops it looking a little scruffy thing. Right, I've moved from those northern clayey heaths into the lower greensand now. In Apps and the greater Borthwood area, we have records from Apps of pennyroyal mint here. Again, one of those classic village green, hard grazed, very hard grazed, hard dunged heathland edge, growing in amongst chamomile, which, hurrah, it still survives, I believe, at St Helens Green. I haven't seen it for a few years, but where in the absence of trampling heavy animals, it will survive under the gang mower. That greater Borthwood Apps area, of course, was the first place in Britain for wild gladiolus to be recorded. We're very proud of it being a New Forest species, but it isn't confined to the forest. It was in Dorset and it was on the Isle of Wight as well. And of course, that part of the island was known for heathland birds. One of the earliest records we have of the island's wildlife comes from this area, record made by Sir John Oglander. Interestingly, the record in his diary relates to an incident that occurred the year he was born, and he records many heathcocks known especially in round Borthwood, and recounts an incident where somebody was caught for poaching them. Again, interestingly, with his gun, because firearms, you know, we're talking about the Tudor period here, firearms were only just sort of becoming useful for killing small things. Black grouse, of course, well, even until the 1920s, were breeding in the New Forest. They were in the Wealden Heaths at Woolmer. If you went up the Trent Valley, there were those enormous heathlands of the cover sands of Lincolnshire, Scunthorpe, Gainsborough, that area, all around the heathlands of Sherwood in Nottinghamshire. You know, we're talking about heathlands there of between about 5,000 and 10,000 hectares each, enormous heathland blocks. But since the 1920s, particularly with the advent of state-sponsored forestry, their habitats have been highly fragmented and destroyed. And we now think of them as a species of the north and the west and the uplands. And there's this whole suite of species of the lowland heaths of Britain, which we've rather forgotten are lowland species. And we've started thinking of them as, you know, up north, the distant things like corncrake. You know, you read the old accounts, and corncrake or landrails were really quite common and widespread in heathland landscapes. And now they're a thing for the Outer Hebrides, where they are rather glorious if you can see them. So, what have I shown you? I've shown you a lot of gloom. It's not going to get that much better. But heathlands are dynamic. These species, which like abuse, uh, things to be broken and then recovered. Breckland is a heathland type which we celebrate in East Anglia, but it was quite widespread throughout Britain. Here's a photograph of Hill Heath that the Wildlife Trust recently bought, and I believe John is going to say more about the Hill Heath Alveston area. But I don't have a photograph of the adjacent land, which, like this, was arable and then went, in this case, into a tree planting scheme where the Boswell family planted their Field of Hope, which is now occupied by red squirrels. But during that initial phase of establishment, colonised up with lichen heath, Adam Wright surveyed the invertebrates there, I think it was 2011, 112 species of Hymenoptera on an area of intensive maize field less than a decade earlier. That includes species of great national rarity and species previously unknown on the island. Without flogging the illusion, the Field of Hope could be the Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. If you're into your film references. 112 species of Hymenoptera. Here's one of the Hemipteras that moved in, the gorse shield bug, Pisadorus, lovely creature, a specialist on gorse. It is very much a dwarf shrub, heathland shrub species. But these things are mobile. If you offer them the opportunity, they will move in. And it's not just individual species, they will move in as communities. And when Adam Wright did his survey at Newchurch, the things like Astata boops, this wonderful little, I think it's a wasp, had moved in, which is a specialist predator on the bugs, including our gorse shield bug. This can happen very fast if the opportunities are right. I'm going to go back to my conjectural map for the last few thoughts. Here we are in about 1600. Well, that's the map I drew up in the late 1980s. I now know I almost certainly have miscalculated the extent of heathland in the Ashy Hardingshoot area. I think it's much more extensive than shown here. And having lived and worked on the New Forest for a fair number of years, I realised that things like Colwell Common, Heaton Hill, Freshwater Green, there was almost certainly a matrix of very closely connected greens and lanes, and quite a complicated heathland landscape, including things like arable fields moving in and out of heathy ground. So this is an underrepresentation. Since well, it's not necessarily a peak, but since that period of heathland in the island's landscape, we have lost somewhere between 97 and 98% of it. That is catastrophic. Most of the losses that we can attribute a source have either been lost to dereliction, where farm subsidies were not supporting the management of marginal land, or public subsidy for plantation forestry. You're almost got a map here of the Forestry Commission's influence on the island, where they knocked out the heathlands on the chalk, most of the heathlands on the chalk, as well as places like Parkhurst and Hampstead and elsewhere. But times are changing. Setting the tree planting debate aside, in terms of public funding of agriculture, of rural land management, we're being asked to spend public money for public benefits. And the land uses that we've regarded as conventional are changing. They are being diversified, and they're being diversified in a way that can bring real benefits to wildlife, not just the odd field margin here and there. The island is a little bit behind on the curve. There are some very interesting sites such as Brailsford, which again John might talk about, where landscapes are being changed. But throughout Britain, farming is changing, wilder landscapes are being reinstated, particularly on the unproductive marginal farmlands. It is happening on the island. I'm aware of future opportunities on the island. It will happen here, and some of them will be heaths. Let's return to my title about changing fortunes. This is my last slide. We are at a very low ebb, our heathlands. They are, well, we're a sort of an average county, average English county. It used to be a commonplace landscape habitat, and now it's very rare. Where the island, I think, is different is our exceptional capacity to rebound. The image you've got here, you've probably all walked that piece at the back of the Wight. There are a huge number of heathland species living in non-heathland landscapes on the island. We know, because of the work of the Boswells, Adam Wright and others, that this reservoir of species is mobile, and it's mobile not as just as individuals, it's mobile as ecosystems. We also know from some of the vascular plants that they are persistent. They hang on in there. And indeed, sometimes they pop out and you're thinking, where on earth did that come from? Where was that seed source? But they do reappear. Things have been rediscovered. We have this great benefit of geological instability, which gives ecological stability. If you're a species of broken ground, this is just a wonderful place to live, and is a place to survive during the hard times when your heathland habitats in inland Isle of Wight have been reduced to virtually nothing. So new landscapes are emerging. Some of them will be heaths. The heathlands of the future will be different from what was there in the past. I would argue it's unnecessary, even unwise, to try to predict and control what that future may be. I like wildlife to be wild. What I look forward to before I retire or get taken away elsewhere is to get back to walking the Wight, wandering around, finding those newly emerged rough places in the hope of encountering unexpected things in a revitalized landscape that's full of wonder and hope. So thank you for listening.
Right, our next speaker is Richard Grogan. Richard has been on the island for about 35 years, came originally to study dormice, and he spent his time in nature conservation, managing nature reserves, advising landowners, writing and implementing management plans, championing rare species and directing landscape scale change in habitats. Currently, he's the lead officer for the Wild Wight AONB, and as such, he's led the bid for the Unesco Biosphere designation for the Isle of Wight, which we were given 2 years ago. And he's also the county mammal recorder. So lots of experience to draw on. Over to you, Richard, for your talk, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Anne. I have no slides. Shall be a talking head for the evening. So if you'd like to close your eyes and relax and think about a woodland you know on the island, and I'll tell you about why they're so important. But first of all, I'd like to talk a bit about why we became a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. Then I'd like to talk about the woodlands and particularly the mammal fauna. I'm afraid I'm a mammal man. My training is in mammal ecology, and I enjoy very much the cut and thrust of looking for mammals which tend to be small and nocturnal. And then I'd like to finish up about the future, particularly of the biosphere and of the future for woodlands and mammals within them. So in the world, there are 700 UNESCO Biosphere Reserves. And the 2016 vote to withdraw from the European Union led us to fear that maybe the island's habitats and species and its environment might get lower in the pecking order. Its credentials may suffer. So we looked at how we could keep that emphasis on the environment of the Isle of Wight going. And so we looked at the biosphere model. So myself, Peter Fellows, Peter Taylor, and Ian Boyd looked at submitting a application to UNESCO for the Isle of Wight to become a biosphere reserve. And then myself and Joel Bateman spent 3 years talking to people, filling out forms, 154-page form, which is quite daunting. And 2 years later, in 2019, in June, the UNESCO gave us our biosphere status. The biosphere covers 915 square kilometres of land and sea, with the coast of Dorset, the coast of Hampshire, right the way across the island and then out into the Channel. Only about 390 kilometres square of that area is land. And obviously it includes all the famous bits of the Isle of Wight, the Needles, Cowes Harbour, Parkhurst Forest. And we were very keen to emphasise how important that wildlife is. 75% of the Isle of Wight's land surface is designated for its landscape, for its wildlife, or for the species that inhabit those things. And so we live in a very high hub of biodiversity. So the UNESCO Biosphere Reserve was about celebration of the past. Obviously, some things were going on the Isle of Wight that made it important in terms of its wildlife and its landscape that perhaps were being lost in the rest of southeast England. And I think a lot of people fail to appreciate how important the Isle of Wight is in the southeast England in terms of its wildlife and its environmental value. And the biosphere is really about three things. It's about nature, it's about people, and about how those two have come together and impacted upon the environment to create a sense of place. So we're going to talk about woodlands. Woodlands cover roughly 10% of the Isle of Wight's land surface, about 3,500 hectares. 45% of those are ancient woodland sites. So that's sites that are thought to have been woodland before 1600. And that date is chosen because tree planting really didn't get up and running in Britain and the establishment and protection of trees and woodland until after that date. So Henry VIII was one of the first people to actually require trees to be planted. And obviously these were for the shipbuilding, which his daughter would later require to beat the Spanish off. They include ancient broadleaf woodlands, secondary woodlands, plantations, and wet woodlands. And just about any land can have woodland on it, except the saltwater coast. Saltwater kills these plants, but in most other habitats and most other geologies, woodlands will form. And their character changes depending on how they're managed. We have wood pasture where animals graze under the trees in a closed canopy. We have parkland where they graze under an open canopy. We have high forest where the canopy is closed, and that tends to prevent understory from growing underneath. So those small little plants cannot grow, but are very well established. And then we have a coppice with standards, which is a very common characteristic of the island's woodlands, where you have tall trees and small trees growing underneath it, field maple, ash, hazel. And we also have wet woodlands, carr, either dominated by willow, alder, or a mixture of the two. And these are woodlands that where the trees can live for at least part of the time with their feet in water or sodden mud. The majority of our woodlands are north of the chalk. There are some significant woodlands south, Borthwood, Montcombe, but most of the established woodlands are north of the chalk on the clay. And this is where the management of woodlands tends to have been dictated. So like Gaul, the Isle of Wight is divided into three parts. We have the clay to the north, which promoted cattle growing and woodland. We had the chalk in the middle, which was good for sheep. And then we had the south on the green sand, which was mainly used for arable. But the important thing about our woodlands is that they are unique in Britain. They are unique for the mammal fauna that they have, and also the mammal fauna that they don't. We have what's always referred to as the big four. We have red squirrels, which everybody I imagine is familiar with. We have the common dormouse, or hazel dormouse as it's called now, because it's not so common anymore. We have Bechstein bats, and we have barbastelle bats. And all these mammals are nationally rare. Some of them are internationally rare. And they grow and they live cheek by jowl in our woodlands across a variety of different sorts. But they need the similar things. They need old trees to nest or hibernate in, and they need a healthy understory of hazel or willow or field maple or ash, but they also need age, because the other things that grow up with them, bramble, honeysuckle, and other such plants, are all part of that habitat. The honeysuckle provides building materials for red squirrels' drays and also for dormouse nests. The bramble and other lower plants provide invertebrate food for things like the dormouse, and particularly moths for the bat species. And these mammals have benefited from one major issue about our woodlands, is that we do not have large herbivores roaming about in them. So the structure of the wood is beneficial to them without the grazing of deer or other animals. And those characteristics have become very important to conserve these mammals through time, particularly when man started to influence the change in woodland cover, particularly since he started to clear it for agriculture. So we also benefit not just from not having deer, but we don't have grey squirrels. And I was talking to my daughter last night, and she was asking me, how long do you have to live on the mainland before you stop using the word grey before you say squirrel? Because most of her friends don't even think about the fact that there are two squirrel species in Britain. She's used to seeing reds and they're used to seeing greys. And it's an interesting cultural difference that we've got. So people growing up on the Isle of Wight talk about squirrels and always referring to red ones. Our island is an island. It has been separate from the mainland for a good long time, thousands of years. And as such, its separation, its severance, and the management of its woodlands has allowed these, the flora and fauna, and particularly the mammals, to produce this distinctive character. They are uninfluenced by deer, and this understory provides their habitat. However, humans have sought to influence woodland management. They first cleared woodland for agriculture. They then realized that actually wood is quite useful. And so they built their houses with it. They built their boats with it, and they burnt it for fuel. And so the management of woodland became intrinsic to the future of its existence. And those mammals within those woodlands had to adapt. And so the squirrels and dormice and bats were all able to cope with that management techniques, which cleared the understory but allowed it to regrow and allowed a better atmosphere for these woodland mammals to keep on going. But the isolation, which has benefited some things, has obviously caused issues as well. And particularly in terms of how those populations will benefit into the future. And so we need to think about how we might be able to look to conserve these species, and also how the biosphere might help in that regard. And one of those things that we're going to come up against is mitigation against climate change. Carbon, we are continuing to pump carbon into the atmosphere. We would want to reduce the usage of carbon, but also try and take it out of the atmosphere. And one of the things we might be able to do that successfully is through the planting of trees, or in our case, because we don't have deer, perhaps just the regeneration of tree seeds. We don't have to plant every tree to increase that woodland cover. Woodlands have about 100 tons of carbon per hectare. That's how much they can store. But woodlands can also store over 100 tons of carbon a hectare in the soil. And this dual effect means that an increase in woodland cover over the Isle of Wight would not only benefit the species that we've described, but would also look at taking some of the carbon that is causing the climate change that we have been seeing and store it in the trees and in the woods. This would lead also to about 2.5 tons of carbon a year being taken in by our woodlands per hectare. So not only do they store carbon, they're a net sink of carbon over time. However, in order to look at climate change mitigation just for the Isle of Wight, to produce a net zero of carbon by 2030, we'd have to plant about 760 hectares. That's the combined size of Parkhurst and Bryson Forest again. That is about 836,000 trees and about £7 million in order to achieve that. And interestingly, it brings up a lovely scene, is that where would you do this? Clive was talking about restoration of other habitats. We're talking about the growing of food in agriculture. And Ian Boyd, in a previous talked about coastal squeeze. Well, here we've got a land squeeze. Are we going to have to do all these things on this small patch of ground? Growing trees for carbon sequestration, producing food, producing the other habitats, restoration of other habitats that we'd want to see. You can see that we have this dual paradox, perhaps, that an increase in woodland would increase the habitat for the species that we've described, red squirrels, dormouse, these iconic, rare, important species. But with only a limited amount of land, we would have to prioritize where we might do this in favor of other habitats and looking at the combat for climate change. And those conversations will need to go on at a very stage, and perhaps even starting tonight. How our land use would need to be changed in order to produce the things that we would want to see going on to the future. Do we want more woodland, or do we want more heathland, or are there other habitats that we would like to see, wetlands perhaps, in our future Isle of Wight? So the biosphere was about 3 things, really. One of them is turning an environmental frown upside down. It's about celebrating the wildlife and that we have, and also the interactions between that wildlife and human beings, and how will that change over time. It's about celebration and it's also about the future. I'm a fat, balding old man with a dodgy back, dodgy eyes, and an even dodgier dress sense. This is not about me. This is about the people coming after me. This is for Kitty and Fran, and for Willow and Louis, my children and grandchildren, and it's for your grandchildren as well. And these conversations have to go on because things will change. The climate will change it anyway. And we need to talk about how we're going to adapt, how we're going to mitigate, and how perhaps we can keep the biosphere as a place for both humans and red squirrels, dormice, Bechstein bats, and everything else in some kind of harmony, perhaps when the rest of southern England is going under concrete. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. There's plenty there for people to think about, and I hope ask questions about. We'll press on with our final speaker of the evening and hope that we got all these questions coming in. Our final speaker, John Cox, I think we could describe as a lifelong member of the Society. He was born on the island and introduced to the Society by his parents, Mary and Lou. Attending Society meetings got him hooked on natural history, and his highlight was the annual fungus foray that Oliver Fraser led. He spent some time off the island in London studying, but then came back at about the same time as Clive and Richard, and John was working for the Nature Conservancy Council at that time. He left the island in 1985 to continue working with the Nature Conservancy Council and then English Nature as the Conservation Officer for South and East Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. He left English Nature after a while to work as an independent ecological consultant, and that work has taken to many areas of the UK and more widely across Europe. But he's always maintained contact with the island through his involvement with conservation and management of Riddleston copses for the PTS. So Jonathan, over to you for your talk, please.
Well, thank you, Anne. Hope everybody can hear me tonight. I'd just like to say that I'm really, really honoured to be asked to speak to this Society meeting to celebrate 100 years. As Anne mentioned, my parents were particularly active members of the Society. And I owe the Society a great deal because, as Anne said, it got me on my road to my career. And looking back, those early days at Newtown Camp, which was jointly sponsored by the Society, which initially used to be run by Oliver Fraser and then by my father, were great experiences, truly immersing you in nature, both physically and mentally. And I think that's one of the great achievements of the Society is in introducing people to the wonders of the natural world. I've started off with this slide looking at the up western Solent from the Needles, and you can see all those white dots in the sea. That's the Round the Island race. And so I'm going to give you a bit of a round the island race today, looking at the habitats on the island, and it follows something of the similar sort of curve to Clive's talk, to talk about what we have, perhaps what we've lost, or some of the low points in the conservation of our wildlife and natural habitats on the island, and then thinking about the future. So first slide. So the island is has a great diversity of habitats. And so this little graph on the left-hand side here is a comparison of the habitats on the island in terms of percentage area with those more widely in southeast England. So you see that in terms of, first of all, there's a good diversity of habitats here, from saline lagoons, sand dunes, salt marshes, vegetated shingle, grazing marshes, lowland heathlands, calcareous grasslands, unimproved neutral grasslands, and woodlands. And you see that for woodlands, we're a bit behind the curve in that southeast England has got more ancient woodlands than we have in terms of percentage area. But for other things like our neutral grasslands, and particularly our calcareous grasslands, and our salt marshes, we do better than the rest of the southeast of England. And this picture of a group of pencils here is harking back to my early days when I started work for the Nature Conservancy Council. My job then was to go and map all the SSSIs and map all the habitats on those SSSIs and colour them in with this range of coloured pencils. And we had 14 coloured pencils to describe the different habitats present on our mapped areas. And I spent the summer in 1983 mapping all these sites of special scientific interest. And obviously, as you colour in your maps, you have to sharpen your pencils, and so they get shorter and shorter. And so at the end of the summer, I could line up my pencils and get a rough idea, like a histogram, of roughly how much habitat we had of each of different type by the length of the pencils. Now, this isn't actually those pencils, but it's very similar to them. And what was amazing was not only that that it gave you a good indication that there was quite a lot of woodland and quite a lot of grassland on the island, but also that I'd used all of those 14 pencils to colour in some habitats somewhere on the Isle of Wight. And that's just sort of indication of the great diversity that we have on the island. And so you start to wonder, why have we got such a great diversity of habitats? So here we have some geology maps. And I apologise for not being as expert as our earlier speakers in this series on talking about geology, but I'll start up here in the sort of top left-hand corner of your screen. You can see the Isle of Wight here nestled in amongst this orange and pink area of geology. That's the Hampshire Basin. And you see it runs through the north of the island. And then up here is the Thames Basin. These are the younger tertiary rocks. And so the island shares something in common with the wider Hampshire Basin, stretching from Dorset here right the way through to Sussex in the east, and the Thames Basin. And then on the south of the island, we've got these, what we call the Cretaceous Rocks, the chalk and the upper and lower greensands. And you see these outcrop again in the Weald of Hampshire, Sussex and Kent. So the island is a microcosm of all this much wider geological area. So you can see that here on this map here. The north of the island is this mixture of tertiary clays, marls, some limestone outcrops, more or less horizontally bedded, apart from where you get down to the chalk here, and then overlain by sheets of gravel. We have the chalk ridge through the middle, and another chalk plateau down to the south here at Ventnor, and in between the greensand. And in particular, I'd like to point out the upper greensand. Oops, sorry, now it's starting to do its own thing. Right. The upper greensand outcrops along the edge of the chalk, particularly in the northern edge here. And I'll return to that in a minute because it creates some really interesting landscape types and associated habitats. I've just included this more detailed map of the geology of the island. This is the old one I used to have my bedroom wall, so hence the creases. But it shows in more detail these sheets of gravel extending over Cowes, East Cowes, and how do you see how they mirror those on the north of the Solent in the New Forest, and that's associated with these heathland habitats that Clive was talking about earlier on. I haven't got time to go through all of the diversity of habitats on the island, so I thought what I'd do is just pick out a few things which are both special to the island, and then some of those things which we don't have on the island, which are more frequently found across the mainland. And one of the more obscure and interesting habitats on the island are these soft rock cliffs or coastal slopes. These are amazing habitats. I grew up near Gurnard and found myself often knee deep in this sort of heavy, wet clay. We used to call it pug. Later coming back, I realized how interesting they are ecologically because they support plant communities which are simply undescribed elsewhere in the UK. In the spring, they have this abundance of coltsfoot flowering. And if you look in the books like the National Vegetation Classification, Coltsfoot's hardly mentioned, and where it is, it's only mentioned as a sort of a weed of old gravel pits. But here it is in its native habitat on these crumbling, wet clay cliffs, growing with greater horseshoe. You can just see the spikes of the greater horseshoe coming through here in the springtime, and this wood small reed. And the great thing about these habitats, as Clive was talking earlier on, is their dynamism. So in the summer, they dry out into these amazing patterned landscapes. In the winter, they form great mud glaciers falling down the cliff slope and into the sea. Really special habitat for which the island is really the best place to see it in the UK, I think. We've got them all around the north coast of the island, but also along the south coast where they have the clay outcrops. The island's also really good for its lowland meadows, and moving across to the mainland where I am now, you realise just how different they are to many of these lowland meadows you find elsewhere in southeast England. One of the remarkable things is the abundance of this stuff, the yellow Dyer's greenweed, which grows in abundance on the meadows around Newtown and elsewhere on the island. I think that might be due to a sort of degree of calcareous influence in the soil. This is the original sort of ancient meadow that's not been ploughed for probably hundreds of years. But you see here on the right here, these are pictures from Bridlesford that I took recently, showing just how quickly some of these meadow flora can recolonize after ploughing. You can see after the top right-hand corner here, there's an abundance of common spotted orchids, the grassleaf pea, that red flower, lots of oxeye daisies, and the long-named corky-fruited water dropwort all seem to turn up relatively quickly after these meadows have been allowed to revert. It just shows just how resilient some of our nature can be if you give it a chance. Clive's talked already about the downs, but I think again, moving off the island, you just really appreciate how lucky we are on the island to have these fantastic chalk grasslands. They are remarkable in a number of ways, partly because of their landform. You've got these south-facing slopes, then a plateau on the top of the ridge of chalk, and then a north-facing slope, all in juxtaposition, creating a great diversity of grassland habitat. And also what is amazing is these south-facing slopes are really baked hard in the summertime. And that creates conditions where trees probably can't really get roots. And so when we were looking at the Afton Down road inquiry many years ago, we were looking at the soil structure in the chalk grasslands on the south face of Afton Down. And they're patterned soils. And it's possible that that patterning was created by periglacial ice action that moved the pebbles of flint around, suggesting that these slopes have never actually been wooded in their history since the recession of the ice sheets. So these could be what we call primary grasslands, in that they have never been wooded. And it's a remarkable thing. And then that habitat creates a niche for the Adonis blue butterfly, which is one of the island's specialities associated with the horseshoe vetch. Also, the sawwort, which we find growing on the chalk here, which links it with the chalk outcrops in Dorset. Whereas species like the round-headed rampion, which is common in parts of Hampshire on the chalk, doesn't occur on the island. So we have these links with Dorset, but distinctions from the Hampshire chalk. Salt marshes are also remarkable on the island. In terms of area, we've got percentage-wise more than other counties in southeast England. But what's special about the island salt marshes, in my view, is that we have these wonderful transitions. Salt marshes are part of this wider ecosystem of estuaries. Estuaries are all about the conduit for wildlife from fresh to salt, and the transitions from salt to terrestrial and through high to low water. And that expression of variety of transition is much better illustrated on the island than anywhere else I know in the Solent. So we have the Spartina Marshes, which are ubiquitous on the Hampshire shore. But what's important are these higher level mixed marshes you can see here with the sea lavender flowering, often with abundance of the sea thrift, Armeria maritima. And then going up the estuary towards the freshwater transition, we find interesting species like we have here on the Clamakin Brook of the aster, sea aster, and also remarkable plants like the marshmallow. Again, you know, they do occur elsewhere around the Solent, but on the island we have these full transitions. There's a number of other special plants that we find in these transitional zones, such as the divided sedge and the wild celery. And the Newtown marshes are also obviously important for the small cordgrass, the Spartina maritima, which is a really rarity now in the Solent. Richard's talked quite a lot about woodlands, so I won't go on too much about them, but just to talk a little bit about ancient woodlands on the island. The island's got about an average sort of amount of ancient woodland compared to other counties in the country. About 1,600 hectares of ancient woodland, but a lot of that, as you can see on the map on the top right here, has been replanted with non-native conifer species. That's the red areas, whereas the darker green patches are the ancient and semi-natural woodland that still keep the native mix of trees, plants, and shrubs, and all those mammals that Richard was talking about as well. But we can just sort of divide the island's ancient woodlands, as Richard was doing, into sort of three zones. Up in the north here, we've got these tertiary clay woodlands. Then we've got groups of chalk woodlands up on the downs, those ones around the Rowridge Valley and around Gatcombe, and then over in the East Wight. And then we've got lower greensand woods, not many of those, but particularly around Borthwood Copse are the best expression of those lower greensand woods. But what I want to talk to you about is a little bit about these. Sorry, let me go in here. I want to talk about later is the upper greensand woods, and I'll come on to those in a minute. Isle of Wight birds is also important. Are also really important, particularly the woodland birds. There's a picture here of old brown owl being tormented by red squirrels in Beatrix Potter's book. But obviously we don't have the tawny owl nesting on the island, so you won't see that seen here on the island. But what we do have are these other owls, the barn owl and the long-eared owl, which are comparatively much rarer on the mainland. There's other differences in the island bird fauna. You know, we don't have nuthatches, and they're occasionally seen, but not really nesting. The nightingale is probably better represented on the island than it is on the mainland, but perhaps that's in decline. But the marsh tit, unfortunately, which is still quite widespread here where I live in Livington and in New Forest, is now, I think, extinct on the island. So there's changing fortunes for our woodland birds. And the other sort of ancient woodland that I'd like to just dwell on a little bit is what I call Solent hedge woodland. Around the coast of the island and around the coast of much of the Solent, we have these remarkable woodlands which have their feet in the salt. And they don't seem to occur anywhere else in the UK. If you go further to the west of us, down into the Dorset, Devon, and Cornwall rears, you find that the salt marshes, there's a transition from ancient woodland straight into mudflat because the profile of those estuaries is quite steep, Very rarely do you get this intermediate salt marsh zone. Whereas if you go to the east of here, that transition is so flat. So the marshes of southeast England, the woodland's been removed. So it's only really in this central zone of central southern England do you find this remarkable transition from mudflat through salt marsh and into these ancient woodlands. And these are typified by species like the wild service tree, which seems to grow preferentially around these coastal saline woodlands, both on the island at Riddlesford Copse is a good example, or around the King's Quay estuary, and in places around the Newtown estuary. They're very similar ecologically to those in the Bewley River and up in the Hamble. And one wonders why they've persisted in that way, and why they've got this remarkable similarity in their ecology. The other place we get coastal woodlands is obviously on the cliff tops, and here on the bottom left-hand picture you can see those ancient woodlands tumbling down onto the beach at Burnt Wood. And one of the features of these coastal woodlands, now Clive's already commandeered this plant as a heathland plant, but I'm going to contest that. I'm going to call it a woodland plant. This is the narrow-leaved lungwort, which we on the island have a special, has a special place with us. You can see this top map here is its national distribution. Just a few little blue dots on the north of the island, around Hampshire shore through the New Forest, and then up the Stour River Valley into Dorset. So this is all mapping out the ancient Solent River Valley where it grows. And then on the island, it's confined to these northern woods, particularly these coastal woodlands I was talking about, where it can also grow out into areas of bracken that we've talked about earlier, and often grazed wood pasture habitats as we have them in the New Forest. Now, returning to the Upper Greensand, Upper Greensand is really an amazing outcrop because it has these very distinctive woodlands growing on it. Here we have on the left, on the right, sorry, two pictures taken for me by Colin Pope of cliff copse down near Shanklin, which is these are calcareous woodlands with ash and field maple and oaks, but with wet flushes occurring halfway down the slope where the impermeability of the greensand is slightly stronger, allows water to percolate out on the surface, so you get plants like this opposite leaf golden saxifrage. And then on the left, you can see a picture that was loaned to me by Clive of similar upper greensand hangers in East Hampshire. And so after leaving the island and working in East Hampshire, it was really amazing for me to see the similarity between the upper greensand escarpment in the two places. So the top left picture here, you can see taken from Google Earth, a picture of Cliff Copse, which is on the island, following the greensand scarp below the chalk, north facing. And then down the bottom picture here, you can see a similar escarpment at Selborne in East Hampshire. So this is the greensand escarpment here. This is the famous Selborne Hanger, where Gilbert White used to hang out. And then in these woods, you find an abundance of this plant, the wych elm. In Hampshire, they have this Paris quadrifolia, the herb Paris, also growing with Solomon's seal, two plants which for some reason had never made it across to the island. Presumably they didn't colonize before the land bridge was broken. So that's another really interesting thing to contrast and compare the island's ecology with that of the mainland. What's missing from the island? Well, on the left we have the magnificent chalk rivers of Hampshire, which are an amazing habitat which we really don't have on the island. The best we have is the little brooks at parts of Calbourne at Winkle Street and the Lukeley Brook. But on the Hampshire chalk, we have these lovely, wide, crystal clear chalk rivers with abundance of floating ranunculus. That's just simply a reflection of the island's size and ecology. We don't have those. But as Clive was mentioning earlier on, we used to have much more of this open heathland landscape that we see here on the right. This is the New Forest, and I've deliberately picked a picture of the New Forest showing the heaths mixed with the wood pasture and grassland, and then mires. This is down on the bottom right here. This is these sphagnum-dominated marshy areas, acid, base pore, with lots of insectivorous plants like these sundews. We find, as Clive was saying, echoes of these habitats that were present in the on the island. We look at the floras, Bromfield and Townsend recorded bogs supporting this sort of habitat back in the 19th century. They've all been lost. Even more recently, the flora of the Isle of Wight recorded places like Creedmoor Bog, saying go there on the 30th of June, the finest collection of bog plants on the island. Wellington boots are essential. White sedge, bog asphodel, roundleaf sundew, bog bean, heath-spotted orchid, etc. Well, I went there in 1983 and I searched and searched but couldn't find any sundews. And I'm afraid that habitat has also now changed beyond recognition. So to Elvis Toe Marshes, and this really does illustrate the loss of these habitats on the island. This is a map that I drew back in 1983 when my first job was to go and map out those SSSIs. And you'll see my handwritten scrawl on the left here, referring to this part of the site, which was a triangle area of ground, once an extension of the Phragmites reedbed fen, but had now been bulldozed and to level bare peat. And then down here, this was another area, huge drain was dug all the way through this SSSI at the time to this point here, where the recently dug drainage ditches are connected by a large drain passing under the river. So this is a time in the early 80s when agriculture was progressively damaging and destroying our remaining wildlife habitats. But at that time, there was this really lovely little area here, this little valley called Hill Heath, which has a drain, which had a drain up it. And the whole area, Hill Heath Woodland, this little glade of, I've got my cursor over here, was of open bracken and bluebells. Cattle were roaming across the habitats from the brushy pasture at the bottom, which is just illustrated at the north on this photograph at the top of the slide. And there was a drain running through the Hill Heath called Hill Heath Drain, which was rich in bog plants, bog bean, the marsh cinquefoil, really great piece of habitat. And then a few years later, after I'd done this survey, I got a call from a lady called Jill Green living on the island, saying that the Water Authority have wrecked Hill Heath Drain. They've been in there with a digger and dug the whole thing up. So one officer of the Nature Conservancy Council, I decided, well, we had to take some action. So I contacted the lawyers and I contacted the Southern Water Authority who had done it at the time, done the damage. And the organisation backed me up and we took Southern Water to court. So I'll just come on to that slide in a minute. And so we went to the Island Magistrates Court, and the National Rivers Authority, as they then had become, were fined for the damage that they'd done. And they appealed to that decision, and things went from there to the High Court, and then on from the High Court to the House of Lords. And I'll come on to talk about that in a minute. Before that, I want to just talk to you about further changes on the River Yard that have taken place over this last century. You can see the pictures on the left here and the replicate one on the right. So this is the picture of Elvistone Yard, of the River Yard at Elvistone from the mid 20th century or early 20th century. You see how the river here is almost at bank top. And here's a comparable river taken in 2014. You see this incised valley through years and years of dredging. So what Southern Water had done to Hill Heath Ditch wasn't anything unusual. They were doing that to all of the rivers. Similar picture down here. This is the same River Yarra at Ulverstone, just upstream from the bridge. You can see here the white lines of the white posts of the old railway line used to run along there. Again, the water is at bank top. Similar view on the right, it's all overgrown now. Scrub has covered up the railway line and the grazing marsh. And again, the river has sunk. So the wetlands that depend on high water levels have dried out. Sorry about the disjunct in this bit of the talk, but this is what the House of Lords decided when I took this case of damage to Elvis Toe Marshes to the court. Law allows ecological vandalism, Lords say. And the report in the New Scientist was, last year, the House of Lords described Southern Water's dredging of ditches on Elvis Toe Marshes, SSSI near Sandown on the Isle of Wight as ecological vandalism. But they also ruled that there was nothing to stop Southern Water doing whatever it liked in the marsh because it was not an occupier of the land and does not have any obligation under Wildlife and Countryside Act to protect SSSIs. This appears to be an open invitation to any water company or installer of electric power lines, gas mains or TV cables to flout the spirit of the SSSI legislation. So that rang bells, and as a result, the Wildlife and Countryside Act was amended, and so undertakers like Southern Water now have to consult with Natural England. So we have that was perhaps an idea of conservation on the island, but something good perhaps came from it. So I'd just like to finish up with a review really of where we are. From that stage where wetlands have been drained, the island's wildlife is on a back foot. Elvis Toe Marshes has been purchased by the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, and they're now implementing a programme of restoration. Hill Heath Marsh and the wood pasture that I saw back in 1983 is now being restored, and grazing is being put back into those habitats to link them up again. There are plans to restore the old River Yar to its former meandering course, and so raising the water levels and reducing that disparity between the level of water in the river and the adjacent floodplain meadows. It's now the case that virtually all of those wetlands between Newchurch and the sea are owned by conservation organisations, whether it's the Wildlife Trust or the RSPB. So I think that's all really positive stuff, and some of that loss, damage, degradation of habitat, we now have an opportunity to reverse that, and that's really, really a good thing. And there are other things on the horizon as well. We've got the Environmental Land Management Scheme, as Clive was mentioning, public money for public goods. We've yet to see quite how that's all going to play out, but that does offer, again, the opportunity to grapple with some of these issues that Richard was talking about. We need to have trees, that's true, but we need trees in the right places. We need the right trees in the right places. And perhaps we want to have some of those open habitats that have been lost, where we still just have echoes in the landscape of what was once a diverse and ecologically rich countryside. We've also now got the situation where biodiversity and natural capital are seen as commodities, and they've got an economic value that can be traded. We don't know where this will all lead, but again, it has the option, there is a possibility here that we can see great advances in the recreation and restoration of wildlife habitats as a result of this changing way in which they are valued. And then lastly, I'd like to return to my first thought about education and engagement with nature. The Society, for me, played a really, really important role in introducing me to the wonders of wildlife. And I see the Society in the future as being really, really pivotal in taking that forward. Natural history for me is not just ecology, it is this wonderful melding of the geology, the rocks, the way in which humans have interacted with their environment over centuries, and the plants and animals that have lived and grown and evolved with that. And I think that's really of great value of the Natural History Society, and it brings all those disciplines together. So that's where I'd like to finish. I hope, I'm sorry about all the interruptions and troubles I had with the technology, but I hope it didn't distract you too much. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. There's very much there for us to think about. A number of questions have related to sort of reintroduction. Someone asked about reintroduction of butterfly species. Whether you'd like to say something about that, Clive? I know you did put a reply in the chat, but not everybody may have seen it.
Yeah, the suggestion was I gave that list of bloom, and is the way to address that to bring some over from the mainland and put them down on the island. Things become extinct for a reason, or extirpated, locally extinct for a reason, and that's because our habitats have been destroyed and what little is left is highly fragmented and in very, very poor quality. And before we start thinking about introducing or reintroducing anything, we need to make sure that we have reversed that harm. So the landscape is actually suitable for the species to live its own life. You know, we can have anything living and growing on the island if we keep it in intensive care ward, and you know it only survives because of our constant attention. Then that's not wildlife, that's a zoo population. So our first challenge is to get the landscape so it is big and healthy and suitable for these species. And then it might just be worth catching our breath to see if they arrive under their own steam, because something like silver-studded blue possibly could. You know, they're not too far away. Some of those other species, well, they've got far greater distances and far more problems. I do worry that we can divert ourselves from really exciting projects which capture the imagination, are awfully good fun, but in the long run don't actually make any difference. You know, we do need projects which make a fundamental change. They drive positive change on the island and don't just meet an attractive diversion.
Thank you very much. And a question for Richard, which I might relate to this as well. Someone's asked, what's the main benefit of the UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, do you think?
The main benefit is to increase awareness amongst the visitors and the residents of the Isle of Wight of how important the place is. Not so much for its intrinsic value, but also the fact that we have a chance here to keep things that the mainland will lose. Clive or Jonathan can tell you how many houses there are planned for the countryside between Portsmouth and Southampton. We do get that kind of pressure, but we're not getting development pressure, but it's nothing like what's happening on the mainland at the moment. And I think what we need to do is to raise our game, get people interested, get people talking about how the environment is an asset, not a constraint. If you talk to planners, they'll tell you all the environmental constraints. The environment isn't a constraint, it's an asset. We've talked about it tonight and we'll continue to talk about it. It's a place where we live. We're only one of 9,500 recorded species on the island, while our dominance is something that perhaps we can question. And I'd leave Hampshire to build the houses and maybe we can have some wildlife.
Interesting thoughts. Certainly the management of land and what use we make of it has come up quite a lot as well. I had a question about what sort of forms of agriculture we should encourage here, and who'd like to go for that one?
First to say, I think agriculture is important. We need to keep agriculture. I don't think we can abandon it, not just because it provides us with food, but also because it is actually vital to the management of a diverse countryside. As we've been talking about this evening, grazing livestock really are essential to maintain our heaths, our downlands, our marshlands, wetlands, and our pasture woodlands. So we do need grazing livestock. And there are opportunities to adapt our arable farming to make that far more benign, with better cultivation methods to sequester carbon in the soils and reduce runoff and a loss of sediment to watercourses. So I think we do need to maintain an agricultural system, both from a biological and a cultural perspective. But I think it needs radical reform, and I think we've got to find a way of achieving that.
Thank you. Of course, the other issue is climate change. In about the 5 minutes remaining or less, perhaps anybody like to put in their comments on that? We need trees, but of the right sort and in the right place. So where's that?
And you instantly link trees to climate change. You know, I would encourage people. You know, John talked about the right tree in the right place. If we want to sequester carbon, which is, you know, why people plant trees in response to climate change, salt marshes are far better than trees at sequestering carbon. The clay heathlands, the glade heaths are extremely good at sequestering carbon. Soil, just soil. If we stopped ploughing the raw chalk of the island and allowed it to develop humic renzinas and other humic-rich soil, there's all sorts of ways our countryside can respond to climate change. Sorry, I'm thinking, my tongue's moving fast in my brain. The deep peats of the Eastern Yar Valley that John was showing, having been vandalised and drained, they are some of the deepest peat deposits and purest peat deposits in southern England, a huge store of carbon. So, yeah, in responding to climate change, let's work out how the whole landscape and all sorts of vegetation and soils can deliver it, and don't sort of jump on the rather politically easy answer of plant more trees, because the sad reality is, in the past, mammals aside, Richard, tree planting on the island has been devastating for its biodiversity.
Just to say, and that my last slide, I forgot to mention that it was overlaid on a picture of small leaf lime. And the reason I picked the small leaf lime is because I think that could be a tree for the island's future, to take account of climate change. If you look at Rob Scaife's pollen diagrams of the island, the small leaf lime was once widespread across our woodlands. We lost it in the sort of early Bronze Age, but I think it's now time to have it back. And we've got one small leaf lime woodland. And if we want to plant some trees or establish new woodlands, let's put that on some areas which are linking up our existing woodlands. And let's put some small leaf lime back on the island.
So trying to get multiple benefits from one scheme then, presumably.
Absolutely, yes. We can do things for all of those mammals that Richard was talking about, and all of our plants, and do something for butterflies as well at the same time.
Right, whether we perhaps ought to be drawing to a close now, but there's been absolutely fascinating discussions this evening, and very many thanks to Clive, Richard and John for their fascinating talks and stimulating discussion. It's given us all a lot to think about, and it does, I think John's comment about education engagement, which has come strongly through all of them, is something that the society might be able to take forward. So finally, it just remains to me to sort of wrap things up a bit and give a vote of thanks to our three speakers tonight and all the other speakers, and but also one or two other people, Joe Redston, who's been dealing with our digital infrastructure and trying to keep us in order when we've done things wrong, and Tina of the I Watch Wildlife Project, who's been doing all sorts of things in the background, just making everything run smoothly. Roger, well, his endless energy, enthusiasm, and extensive network of personal contacts, that's really driven the whole conference programme forward. And also to thank the audience who've given us their time and interest to make it work. It's very difficult talking to a screen when you don't know if there's somebody out there, but we know you're there. We've heard from you. In the coming months, we look forward to meeting you in person again as soon as restrictions are lifted. We've got a provisional programme in place, so keep an eye on the website to see what's planned, and we hope to see you soon on meetings. So thank you all very much.